Hi, my name is Itali, and in this video I'll be drawing a background from reference as background practice. As an artist, I always feel like I can make improvements on the drawings I have done, and one of the places I feel like I'm lacking at the moment, and it's not quite up to the same standard as my character or creature drawings, is my backgrounds, specifically rocks and foliage. So I decided I would do some reference drawing and some coloring to try and improve on these aspects of my drawing ability. I do prefer working from midtones and then doing shadow and then light last, but in this situation I started with the darkest colors first, and basically I'll just be trying to layer up different colors in increasing brightness until I reach the highlight layer. And I did start with this very dark smudgy nothingness, and I was just going to try paint directly onto this to form the shapes, but I very quickly decided I did need to do a sketch, so I did roughly sketch out what was in the reference picture before starting to put down additional colors. For the water, I just started smudging in these different colors, and I was actually quite surprised about the variety of different colors that were involved in this little photograph of a creek, especially the shadow, how blue it was. Normally when I do water without reference, I would only do the parts that are unshaded in blue, as in my mind that would be where the sky is being reflected from the most, but you can quite clearly see here that the part of the creek or the rivulet which is most in shadow is quite blue. And then we have the browns coming through from the bed of the rivulet and reflections from the trees around, adding in some greens. So we've got a lot of greens, browns and blues. And then the foam is the brightest part, the white part, which I will be doing last after I've done all the rest of the creek. So because it was such a mix match of colors and quite messy, I had no problem doing the rivulet. And I did quite enjoy it as well. And definitely I'm going to lock this little reminder away about the different colors that water can be when surrounded by foliage. And you know, there's different brightnesses from the shadow and light coming in as well. And it was quite a good exercise for me to try and remember what water actually looks like, instead of just going on what I have in my mind without reference. Now I do actually spend quite a long time doing these rocks on the right. I do find rocks to be one of my most challenging elements of drawing. I'm not very good at geometric shapes or trying to color different planes of a geometric shape, and I did struggle with these rocks. I was trying to get them quite close to the reference, so I was painting in all these little sketchy details and smudging in colors. But in the end, they kind of just ended up looking like soggy paper bags. And part of that was my own fault. I did add some details that were not in the reference in my frustration, as I was trying to make them look like they were not just one big object, that they were trying, you know, they were separate objects. So you see I added this light part to the edge or the side of the rocks, which isn't actually in the original reference. And I was so frustrated with how these were looking, and that they didn't really look like rocks at all. They didn't look solid enough to be rocks. I actually asked my husband for some help or some advice on these, and basically his advice was to not shade them or color them as sketchy or as paintery as I had done, and to try and do instead more geometric shapes or geometric or flat blocks of color rather than smudgy mixed colors. So I went back in and I painted over the light I'd put on the edge of them, and tried to do these bigger blocks of color rather than the tiny details. I did still do some small details, as the rocks did look very textured to me, and I wanted to try capture that textured feel in. So I did get a texture brush and sort of lightly add some texture after I'd fixed my mistakes. And once I was done with the rocks, I was very happy with them. but especially at this stage of the drawing, I am very unhappy with these rocks. They're better than what I normally do, but they just look kind of wiggly and not solid to me. And I just kept pushing forward with it, hoping that the more detail I added into them, the more they would look like actual rocks. And they did look better, but they still didn't look like rocks to me. Because of my frustration with the rocks, I was jumping between doing the rocks and the grass tufts and the river, wherein originally I'd intended to do them in chunks. So I had intended to do like all the rocks and then all the river and then all the foliage. But I was just so annoyed and so fed up at doing rocks that I kept trying to refresh myself by doing other little parts in between. And I was quite happy with the other parts. Like, I quite enjoyed doing these little sprigs of grass, and grass chunks lend better to my style because they can look messy, where rocks don't really look good if they're messy. They just kind of look like earth. But it was at this stage I listened to my husband's advice and I start erasing away that colored edge to the rocks and painting over parts to make them more one solid piece. I still couldn't resist putting a little bit of detail in, but I was finally starting to become happy with how the rocks look. So I was at first I was annoyed, but I was very happy with the advice my husband had given me. And if anybody else is struggling with soggy bag looking rocks, then I would advise you to take his advice too and try coloring the rocks in solid chunks of color to define the different planes of their geometric shapes. Once I was happy with how the rocks finally were looking, I then added on that bit of texture I was talking about before, just with a crunchy texture brush that I created myself, and I start to move on to the river in earnest. So I actually smudge in a lot of this painted stuff I've got on the river at the moment, which in hindsight might have been a bit of a mistake because I do then end up painting it back in again, but I don't know. I guess that's just how you learn, right? You make mistakes and then you learn from them. I did struggle a bit with trying to get these colors right. My brain sort of malfunctions when I look at the bottom part of this rivulet, where I can see that it has green on it and I can see it has like this dusky blue and brown mixed in, but my brain knows that the bottom of the river is brown, so I should color it brown, and that the reflection is bright green, so it should have bright green reflections. So I was just sort of fighting against my brain to decide what colors to actually use, and I was trying not to teardrop the colors too much, as I wanted to actually learn what the colors were with actually, figuring them out myself. So I did sort of get there in the end, but I do still feel the colors are slightly off. The colors in the photo are not true to real life anyway. In real life, the area, it was much brighter. My camera came out much duller than actual real life, which is generally the case anyway. So I will end up changing the contrast at the end. But at this stage, I was just trying to get the sort of flow, pun intended, of the river colors down, and starting with the foam. Again, I used my favorite crunchy brush, which I made myself, and I just sort of smudged the foam into itself. Then I tried to start doing the foliage, and it was a disaster. I have a few leaf brushes that I've made myself, and I did attempt to use some of the other brushes that come with the program, like this sort of smudgy, weird texture brushes, but I just found none of them really worked, and I've never actually been very happy with how my foliages look. So I actually did stop and create a whole bunch of new foliage brushes, which you see me using now. Now, I do actually think that I have still made these brushes a bit too sharp, and I'll probably go back in and make them a little softer, but I have made another video of me just creating those brushes. So if you'd like to see how I created my foliage brushes, there will be a link to that video at the top here, so you can go check that out. For any part of the foliage you see that has just strokes, like these bits of grass, this is just a standard brush that came with the program, and I'm just drawing individual blades here. And I do still use this process for some leaves after I've used my foliage brush, just to try to break it up a bit and make it look less procedurally generated or like sort of static looking. And the brush I normally use is just the bamboo brush that came with the program. It's just like a softish standard brush with no sharp, like no sort of texture to it at all. It's just round and soft. I'm actually really happy with how most of this foliage turned out in the end. It was worth creating the new brushes and experimenting with them a little bit. And I do like this sort of tealy colored leaf. I did go over top with the lighter part of it, and you'll see me go back in a moment to darken it up again, and using the bamboo brush to add some detail. But I don't want to add too much detail because this stuff is not supposed to be in high focus. And I do plan to maybe draw a dragon, of course a dragon, in this picture at some stage. So the background isn't going to be the focus despite me spending like 3.5 hours drawing it. This is actually just a practice, and the backgrounds are never really meant to be the focus of my picture. This practice is purely just to sort of learn quick ways to make things look convincing, and to try and bring like real sort of stuff back into my backgrounds instead of just making it all up in my head. Sometimes if you just draw straight from your mind, even if you have drawn from reference a lot before, you sort of forget what things really look like and what colors really occur in nature. So I do recommend every now and then going back and using reference, especially if you're struggling with certain aspects of your pictures. A reference really does help. And you can just take your own photos if you can't find what you're looking for. Just go on a little nature walk somewhere and take photographs for yourself. Or, you know, even when I'm just on holiday or something, sometimes I'll just see something and I'll be like, oh, that looks really cool. I bet that would make a really cool background. And I just take a photo and store it in a folder for reference. So here it is though. Here is my finished background. And I'm quite happy with how it turned out, especially at a smaller size. You could almost think it was a photo. It was challenging, but I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I did it. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support me. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time. Bye!